Okay. We're going to go through now the end section of the Gemara and then kind of do a wrap up. So the end section of the Gemara, we started with this assumption of Rav Papa. Rav Papa tried, as we said, to make the Mishnah work out with everybody's opinion. In which case, now the assumption is that Shabbat and Yom Tov versus Erev Pesach had this differential of half an hour, to which the Gemara asks. This is a good example of trying to figure out how to I already sectioned this for you. But if you look here, the last line we read was afilu samuch lemincha, right? It said samuch lemincha sharei, aval be'erev Pesach, on Erev Pesach, even samuch lemincha is also forbidden, meaning there's that difference of the half hour. Then there's this line that seems to somewhat repeat what was just said, which usually means that's going to be questioning an assumption that we just made. So now they say, is it really true? Be'erev Pesach, samuch lemincha sharei? One place said from mincha, and the other said samuch lemincha. That seems like two different things. If samuch means half an hour, those must be two different times. To which the Gemara says, Veha Tanya, but doesn't it say in a Braita? And now they're going to bring another Braita. And here we're going to learn a little bit about Braita. Braita were things that were orally passed down. And because of that, they're often ended up with different versions. The one we saw before said that on Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov, from the time of mincha and on is a problem. But anytime, right, sounded like not the half hour before. But now the Gemara says we have a different Braita. And that Braita says, Veha Tanya, we're 5 lines from the bottom in the Gemara, Lo yochal adam be'erev Shabbat v'yamim tovim, mi tesha sha'ot ulamala. Now, what's tesha sha'ot? Remember, what time is mincha? 9.5 hours into the day. So if it says here, Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbat, and Erev Yom Tov is tesha sha'ot, that's synonymous with samuch lemincha. So now you end up with, right, Kadesh, it says, mitesha shalol lamala, for the exact same reason, Kadesh kanesa shabak shutava, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So what did Rav Papa try to say? Rav Papa tried to say we have samuch lemincha versus mincha, and that's why our Mishnah didn't mention Shabbat, but that now falls totally flat, because we now have this source that says from also samuch lemincha on Shabbat, which means Shabbat and Pesach are identical, in which case our Mishnah cannot fit with Rabbi Yehuda. And here Rabbi Yossi Omer, ochel v'holech ad shetechshach. So you would think that the sugya would end here, because we tried Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, I'm going to make this Mishnah work with everybody. And we brought a Braita, and that doesn't work. So that sounds like that would be the end. Rav Papa's opinion is rejected. Rav Huna seems to stand, which means that our Mishnah is all according to only Rabbi Yossi, who thinks that there's no problem on Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov to eat all day. I keep thinking, every time I learn this sugya, I think of my son who comes home from the army on Fridays, famished, and eats a ton. And it's half an hour before Shabbat, and he starts taking out stuff, put stuff in the sandwich maker, and eats like a whole huge meal. And my husband's staring at him, what are you, crazy? You can't eat right before Shabbat. It's forbidden to do this. And I think about this idea of Kadesh kanesa shabak shutava, and I always say to my husband, don't worry, he's still going to be hungry for dinner. You have nothing to worry about. He's coming from the army. He's famished. He'll eat now, he'll eat then. It's all fine. So I think about that, and we're going to talk about that in one more minute when we finish up. So now there's one thing that's very interesting here. Because the Braita were passed down orally, the rabbis often say, well, maybe that Braita, there was a mistake. This Braita just blew up Rav Papa's theory. Thinking of the army blowing up. Anyway, blew up Rav Papa's theory. But now Mar Zutra says, man lemalan de mitaratztehu. Who's to say that this is a great Braita? Dilma mishabashtahi. Maybe that Braita had a mistake. Maybe it didn't mean Tesha. Maybe it meant 9.5. And then you can put Rav Papa all back in order. And now we kind of open everything up all again, to which we have a very interesting response. Amalei Rav Yemar, be'itema Rav Yemar. Okay, this often happens in the Gemara where somebody says something, but they're not sure whether it was Meremar or Rav Yemar. One could see why Rav Yemar and Meremar all kind of sounds the same. You could see why people would confuse which one said it. But one of them said the following. Ana ikla lepirke de Rav Pinchas. He brings him a story from a day that he went to a lecture in the house of Rav Pinchas. Berei de Rav Ami, the son of Rav Ami. Vika Tana. And a Tana got up. Well, who's a Tana? A Tana is someone, because a Tana is someone who lived in the Tannaitic time period, but a Tana is also, there were people in the Amoraim time period when the Gemara was written that would just recite, they had great memories and they memorized all these sources. And he recited Tana Kameh, he recited exactly the Braita we quoted 2 minutes ago. Vikib Lamine, and the rabbi accepted it, meaning you can't claim this Braita is wrong because I was there in the class when somebody quoted this Braita and the rabbi said, you're right. So you can't just throw out this Braita and say, oh, it must be a mistake. So the Gemara concludes, Hachi kasha, in fact, then there's a difficulty. Ela mechuvarta k'Rav Huna. And therefore, it must be that we hold like Rav Huna. And in the end, even though we tried to make the Mishnah work according to everyone's opinion. In the end, we're stuck and we can't. It only must be that the only reason it didn't mention Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov was because the Mishnah was written according to Rabbi Yossi. And it fits in with Rabbi Yossi, who holds basically there's no problem to eat on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Now, I want to end with two of the interesting questions, and you can read this on your own if you want. Everything's translated into English, so it's not as complicated to understand. But there are two sources I brought on the sheet, which basically go into, I'll pull them up quickly. They go into why Rabbi Yossi would think, and this is a very interesting question, why Rabbi Yossi would think that on Shabbat and Yom Tov, there's no problem to eat. Isn't there a mitzvah? So one of them mentions Kiddush. Don't you have to make Kiddush on wine? And wouldn't you think that on wine, actually, I don't have the right one right now. Anyway, I'll forget the share screen, but wouldn't you think that on Shabbat and Yom Tov, it would be the same thing as Pesach? And this gets down to the core of what it is we're learning here. Because Shabbat and Yom Tov, you have an obligation to eat, have a nice festive meal, you'd need to drink wine. It's really kind of the same. And why would there be a distinction? So there's a number of answers brought. One of them is that eating matzah is deoraita. It's from the Torah. Whereas eating on Friday night, even making Kiddush, really you're supposed to make Kiddush in shul. If you notice, in Friday night davening, we say Vayichulu in our davening. So that's really the real obligation. The obligation of Kiddush from the Torah is to remember the Shabbat. How do we remember it? We remember it with wine. But the remembrance on wine is really only rabbinic in nature. So number one, it's all from the rabbis. Oneg Shabbat, it's also from the rabbis. The other interesting opinion I wanted to bring you is that if you're not, I was thinking about, okay, I'll give you another example from my house. My daughter got back from the army last Friday, totally exhausted. She hadn't slept all week. She was totally non-functional. She went to bed in the afternoon and we said, should we wake you up for dinner or not? Okay. In the end, she said, please wake me for dinner. But according to what this source says, okay, and you can read it on your own, he basically says that you're not obligated to eat if you're not hungry, because Oneg Shabbat is to enjoy Shabbat. And if you don't want to eat and you want to sleep, then you don't have to eat. Okay, don't go quoting this and using it, but it says you don't really have to do this. So there it was in my house last week, exactly this scenario where it really wasn't Oneg Shabbat for her to wake up and to eat dinner. I have to be honest. But that's really what's going on here, that maybe there's no Oneg Shabbat. Now, you can't say the same thing for Pesach. You can't say, I'm not hungry, I'll skip eating matzah the first night. There's something else going on here. And I'll just end with the fact that next week, I'm just telling you now, we're going to skip about 10 pages. Okay, why are we skipping 10 pages? Because the next 10 pages are all about Kiddush and Shabbat, and they have nothing to do, I wouldn't say nothing, but they don't really have a lot to do with Pesach. And you might ask, so why are they here? In this chapter that has so much to do with Pesach, why do we have tons of pages dealing with Kiddush and other things that are rare Shabbat issues and not Pesach issues? And I think that's, if you go back to that Tosfot that we started with about what's the idea here, and Pesach has two things going on at night. And this is, we keep talking about these two aspects. There's the Korban Pesach, there's preparations, there's certain ways that Pesach is just like every Erev Chag. And maybe that's why they started with that question. It wasn't so much technical. It seemed like a very technical question. But what it's really getting at is, what is Pesach all about? And what happens at the night of the Seder? Parts of the meal, as you know, are very similar to a Shabbat meal. And parts of it are very different. And there's this constant interplay between the typical Shabbat experience that happens also on Pesach and the unique Pesach experience that we're going to deal more so with. That's why we're going to skip all these Shabbat topics and we're going to move to Pesach because that's really our topic. But I want to point out here that the reason possibly, and it's a lot of people ask, what's the reason why? There's a huge chunk of pages here all about Shabbat. It's trying to talk about the fact that there's different elements going on here. And I think it goes back to that Tosfot, where Tosfot had said, you can't leave Shabbat aside. Shabbat is tadir. Shabbat happens all the time, and you can't ignore the elements of Pesach that are just like Shabbat. And that's why we specifically spend a while talking about the typical aspects, and then we're going to talk about what makes Pesach unique. And that's going to be more the topics of our course, but this kind of lays the groundwork for the fact that Pesach has different elements associated with it. With that, we will finish for tonight, and we will meet up next week. And great having you all here with us.